I still remember my first drive into Ridgewood Bluffs, a neighborhood perched on a gentle slope overlooking vast farmland. The roads were lined with meticulously groomed shrubs, and each house seemed carefully designed to convey a sense of suburban serenity. A large sign greeted all newcomers. "Welcome to Ridgewood Bluffs, where community meets prosperity." It was precisely the kind of place I had been looking for: peaceful, friendly, and close enough to farmland that I could keep a close eye on the region's agriculture. After all, I was the newly assigned chief agricultural inspector for the state, though nobody in Ridgewood Bluffs knew that yet. My duties involve ensuring that local farms and irrigation systems complied with regulations and that farmland was managed sustainably. Because Ridgewood Bluffs sat adjacent to a patchwork of small fields, I'd chosen a home here so I could be near my work. Those first days were filled with the usual tasks: unpacking boxes, learning which day the trash was collected, introducing myself to curious neighbors. Most people I encountered were cordial, with easy smiles and warm welcomes. Still, my real estate agent had given me a subtle warning before closing the deal. The HOA here is strict, especially the treasurer. She insists on people calling her Karen, even though that's not her real first name. Of course, I assumed it was the usual cautionary tale about an overzealous rule enforcer, common in American homeowner associations. I learned differently on day 3, when Brenda Farncourt, often referred to by others as Karen for reasons soon to be obvious, marched into my driveway, clipboard in hand. She was a middle-aged woman in a pressed polo shirt with the Ridgewood Bluffs HOA emblem on the chest. Her hair was swept into a neatly styled bob, and the severity in her eyes told me she tolerated no deviation from the rules. She offered a tight, polite smile and introduced herself. "I'm Brenda, but you can call me Karen, treasurer of the Ridgewood Bluffs Homeowners Association." I shook her hand carefully. "John Green," I said, giving my usual cover name. "Nice to meet you." Karen tapped her pen against the clipboard, scanning my house and yard with a proprietary gaze. "Lovely property. I trust you've read our HOA guidelines thoroughly. We maintain high standards here to protect our property values." I managed a polite nod. "Yes, I've looked them over. I'll follow any reasonable requirements." Karen's lips quirked at the word reasonable, but she didn't comment on it. Instead, she pointed to my mailbox, apparently noticing a minor detail. "You'll need to make sure the post is painted in the exact shade of white specified. Cloud Pearl number 14. We don't allow custom variations. It's in section 3.1 of the HOA manual." Already, I felt the tension, but I put on my best neighborly smile. "Of course, I'll keep that in mind." Karen seemed satisfied for the moment, making a note on her clipboard. "Welcome to the neighborhood," she said in a voice that carried more warning than warmth. And just like that, she strutted off, leaving me with the unsettling sense that if I didn't toe the line exactly, she would be back, pen at the ready. One of the main draws of Ridgewood Bluffs was its proximity to farmland. In fact, just beyond the last row of houses, a narrow gravel road led down to a cluster of small farms that produced a surprising variety of crops: corn, soybeans, leafy greens, tomatoes, and further up the hills, vineyards of grapes. It was a landscape that glowed with rich color, especially in the morning light. Under normal circumstances, an HOA would have little say in farm operations. Still, the farmland was partially reliant on an irrigation channel that curved around the outer boundary of the neighborhood before snaking into each farm's property. This channel was decades old, a leftover from when the farmland had been a single, massive estate. Over the years, expansions and improvements had been made to ensure water flow was steady. Farmers had partial ownership, but so did the local municipality, which meant there were complex shared rights and responsibilities. On my first afternoon off, I headed down that gravel road to introduce myself to the local farmers. I wore casual clothes and carried a small notebook, hoping to learn more about the irrigation system. If there were any compliance issues, I wanted to address them swiftly. The farmers I met were warm and welcoming. Carlos, who grew tomatoes and peppers, showed me how the irrigation channel passed near his fields before flowing into an underground pipe for the next section of farmland. Marjorie, who specialized in growing grapes for a local winery, explained that a portion of the channel was lined with concrete and had a small set of gates to regulate flow. Overall, everything seemed in order. Water quality was good, distribution was fair, and the farmers seemed content. However, when I casually mentioned I lived up in Ridgewood Bluffs, each farmer reacted with a knowing look. Carlos shook his head. That HOA's tough, you know. They always want to beautify the edges near their property. We worry they'll eventually demand changes that block our water. Marjorie nodded. Last year, they suggested we bury the entire channel, so it would look less industrial. But we need open access for maintenance and monitoring. Took us weeks of debate before we convinced them to back off. I frowned. This was a direct clash of priorities. The farmers needed functional irrigation. The HOA wanted aesthetic perfection. And if I had learned anything from my brief interaction with Karen, it was that she did not back down easily. If she set her mind on something, like removing an eyesore irrigation channel, she would do everything in her power to make it happen, no matter the consequences. The farmers seemed relieved I was on their side. They had no idea I was the state's chief agricultural inspector, someone who could enforce laws protecting farmland and irrigation structures. For now, I want to keep my position discreet. If there was a conflict brewing, I'd prefer to solve it through friendly negotiation before resorting to legal measures. As I walked back, I caught sight of Karen patrolling the edge of the neighborhood in her golf cart. She squinted at the farmland below, as though it was some wild frontier that threatened her pristine domain. A chill pricked the back of my neck. Something told me she had the farmland and its water system in her crosshairs. Over the next few weeks, life at Ridgewood Bluffs settled into a rhythm. I spent my weekdays inspecting farms and managing agricultural compliance throughout the region. Evenings found me in my home office, sipping coffee while reviewing data or outside chatting with neighbors about their day. I learned people's names, walked my dog along quiet streets, and gradually felt like part of the community. Yet, Karen was never far from my mind. I'd see her each morning, gliding through the neighborhood on her golf cart, clipboard in hand. She'd stop by someone's driveway to point out an infraction. Grass an inch too high, a recycling bin left out past pickup time, a fence a few shades off from the approved pallet. Most folks grudgingly complied, not wanting a formal complaint. Then, subtle hints of trouble emerged. Orange notices. Households along the perimeter of the neighborhood received bright orange notices pinned to their front doors. The notices cited proximity to farmland and demanded that any unsightly structures or water fixtures visible from the HOA's vantage be removed or concealed. New bylaw proposals. Karen circulated a draft bylaw that would require any water channels adjoining Ridgewood Bluffs property lines to be aesthetically screened, covered, or relocated underground. The language was vague, but it specifically mentioned health and safety concerns, referencing things like mosquito breeding and unsanitary runoff. Survey flags. One morning, I found little pink flags dotting the stretch of grass near the farmland boundary. They seemed to mark a proposed path for either new fencing or some form of enclosure, effectively walling off the irrigation ditch that ran parallel to the boundary. The perplexed farmers, uncertain of the HOA's intentions, asked me to look into it. Alarmed, I decided to attend the upcoming HOA meeting where Karen was expected to present these new bylaws for a community vote. Given my official capacity, though still undisclosed, I gathered as much documentation as I could about the farmland's legal rights, water usage permits, and county-level regulations. I wanted to be ready just in case. The monthly HOA meeting took place in the Ridgewood Bluffs Community Center, a tidy building surrounded by manicured shrubs and flower beds. Chairs were lined up in rows before a long table at the front, where 4 board members sat. Harold, the HOA president, Linda, the secretary, Mark, in charge of landscaping, and Karen, the treasurer, though many quietly noted she wielded the real power. Residents streamed in, some greeting each other warmly, others wearing wary expressions. Word had spread about the proposed bylaw changes, especially those concerning the farmland boundary and the irrigation channel. Even a few farmers from below the ridge attended, looking anxious about their water supply. President Harold opened the meeting with routine announcements, upcoming neighborhood events, budget updates, and reminders about trash collection. Then he turned it over to Karen, who stood, her posture rigid, chin lifted in pride. "Fellow residents," she began, "we have a serious issue concerning the farmland adjacent to our beautiful community. It's come to my attention that the open irrigation channel running alongside our property line poses a health and safety concern. Standing water can be a breeding ground for insects, and there's always the risk of contamination flowing onto our land." Karen's voice was smooth, but beneath her polite veneer lay an undercurrent of alarmist rhetoric. She clicked a remote, projecting images of water channels onto a screen behind her, pictures carefully chosen to show algae or murky spots. "To protect our children, our pets, and our property values," she continued, "I propose that we require the farmland owners to either cover or divert these channels away from Ridgewood Bluffs. If they refuse, we'll install fencing along our boundary and lock any gates leading to the channel, effectively eliminating the potential hazard." Several farmers rose in protest, pointing out that the water flow was crucial for their crops. Linda, the secretary, tried to interject that this was private farmland, partially regulated by the county. Mark, the landscaping director, shrugged uncomfortably, as though he had not fully supported Karen's proposal, but felt unable to challenge her. I raised my hand, politely waiting to be recognized. Karen's eyes flicked to me, and she sighed. "Yes, Mr. Green." "Respectfully," I said, "the farmland beyond the ridge relies on that channel for irrigation. Any attempt to restrict its water flow could be detrimental to local agriculture. Moreover, the farmland existed long before Ridgewood Bluffs was built. Isn't there a possibility this plan violates their existing water rights?" Karen pursed her lips. "Water rights or not, we are not obligated to host an unsightly, hazardous ditch. Let them figure out an alternative if they care so much about their crops." A hush fell, tension crackling in the air. The farmers glared at Karen. One older farmer, Henry, shook his head and said quietly, "Ma'am, you don't understand how crucial that water is. If we lose it, our harvest fails." Karen responded with a dismissive wave. "That's not our problem. Our concern is the safety and visual integrity of Ridgewood Bluffs." The meeting descended into heated debate. Some residents sided with Karen, fretting about perceived risks. Others felt uneasy, not wanting to forcibly cut off water to their neighbors. After nearly an hour of acrimony, Harold intervened. "We'll schedule a formal vote in 2 weeks," he said. "In the meantime, we encourage all parties to discuss a workable compromise." Karen nodded stiffly, but I caught the victorious gleam in her eyes. She was confident she could marshal enough votes. This was only the beginning of her campaign. After the meeting ended, I lingered in the hallways of the community center, hoping to speak with Karen in private. I wanted to gauge if there was any possibility of reasoning with her, but she was surrounded by a small cluster of residents, half of them praising her stance, the other half peppering her with concerns. I overheard fragments of conversation. "We can't just cut off the farmers. But Karen's right. That ditch is a mosquito haven. My kids are getting bitten all the time. We moved here for scenic views, not to see a muddy channel out back." Frowning, I slipped outside. The evening air was cool. A few farmers stood in a tight circle, commiserating. They shook my hand as I approached. "I appreciate your support in there," said Marjorie, the vineyard owner. "But that woman is unstoppable. She's determined to close off our channel." Carlos rubbed the back of his neck, worry evident in his posture. "If we lose water flow for even a few weeks, we'll lose a season's worth of crops. We can't just move the channel overnight, and it's not cheap. We're all small operations here." I nodded solemnly. "Don't worry. There are legal protections for agricultural operations and water rights. If she tries to forcibly shut down the channel, she'll be in hot water." They glanced at me curiously, as if my certainty sprang from some hidden well of authority. Yet I still wasn't ready to blow my cover as chief agricultural inspector. I wanted to handle this in a neighborly fashion first, hoping we could defuse the conflict. But deep down, I sensed Karen was the kind of person who wouldn't let reason stand in the way of her agenda. That night, I returned home, only to find a neon orange tag taped to my front door. My heart sank as I read the typed message. Notice of compliance. Mr. Green, we have observed unusual activity related to farmland use behind your property. You are hereby reminded of the HOA's guidelines regarding boundaries and water hazards. Any involvement or installation of unsightly water structures could result in fines and further action. Treasurer, Ridgewood Bluffs HOA. So Karen had singled me out too. There was something chilling about her tactic. No direct confrontation, just a formal notice laced with vague threats. I tore the notice down, my mind racing. If she was willing to harass me, how far would she go to browbeat the farmers into compliance? The next morning, fueled by frustration and a determination to protect the farmland, I dived deeper into my official capacity as Chief Agricultural Inspector. I spent hours combing through legal statutes on water rights, farmland easements, and county-level zoning laws. Although Ridgewood Bluffs could pass internal bylaws, they couldn't override state protections for agricultural irrigation, especially channels that have been legally in place for decades. By midday, I had all the documentation I needed to make an ironclad case. If the HOA truly voted to close off the channel or block access to the farmland's water gate, they'd be violating multiple sections of state law. They could face hefty fines, forced injunctions, even potential criminal liability if their actions knowingly destroyed crops. To top it off, the local government had a special farmland preservation ordinance that recognized the historical significance of these irrigation routes. However, I still hoped to settle the matter amicably. I decided it was time to reveal my role, but only to the HOA president, Harold. He struck me as a more moderate figure, possibly overshadowed by Karen's strong personality. If Harold realized the legal jeopardy involved, maybe he could persuade Karen to change course. After scheduling a private appointment, I arrived at Harold's modest, ranch-style home on a sunny afternoon. He greeted me with a timid smile at the door. Inside, the living room was decorated with family pictures, a comfortable sofa, and shelves lined with novels. "How can I help you, John?" he asked, offering me a seat. I took a deep breath. "There's something important you need to know. I'm not just any concerned resident. I'm the Chief Agricultural Inspector for this region. I oversee farmland compliance, including water rights. The irrigation channel Karen wants to cut off is under my direct jurisdiction." Harold's eyes widened in surprise. He stared at me, processing the weight of my statement. "Then, why haven't you said anything before now?" "Because I wanted to handle this peacefully," I explained. "But I can't stand by if the HOA tries to sabotage those farms. It's a serious matter." Sighing, Harold leaned back in his chair. Karen's strong-willed, to put it mildly. Even I find it difficult to rein her in. She believes wholeheartedly that the neighborhood's aesthetic and property values come first. I nodded, handing him a file of documents outlining the relevant laws. "Please show these to the board before the next vote. If Karen pushes for a bylaw that blocks or impedes the channel, it won't just be a local spat. It'll escalate to legal action from the county or even the state. The ramifications could be severe." He flipped through the pages, his expression growing more and more serious. "This is beyond what I expected," he murmured. "I had no idea we'd be in violation of so many regulations. I'll talk to Karen." As I rose to leave, I gently added, "I'd appreciate if you kept my position confidential for now. I'd rather not turn this into a showdown unless necessary." Harold nodded, worry etched into his features. "I'll do my best. Just know, Karen's not easily swayed." I left his house with a heavy heart. If Karen refused to listen, the conflict would escalate. And if push came to shove, I'd have to bring the full weight of my office down on her. I only hoped it wouldn't come to that. That weekend, I noticed new construction vehicles near the farmland boundary. Cement mixers, lumber stacks, and chain-link fencing materials were unloaded in broad daylight. Several farmers rushed to the scene, alarmed, only to find the workers carrying official HOA documentation authorizing them to dig post holes and set up a fence line. The workers claimed they were simply hired by Ms. Farncourt, Karen, to implement the new safety measures. "This is insane," Carlos shouted, gesturing at the equipment. They're planning to fence off the entire channel. I examined the area. Indeed, the lines staked out by pink flags from earlier were now being replaced with metal posts. If left to progress, it would cut direct access to the irrigation channel from the farmland side. Even if the water were still flowing, farmers couldn't easily maintain or clean the channel, which was a critical part of preventing blockages and ensuring consistent irrigation. Amid the chaos, I spotted Mark, the HOA board member in charge of landscaping, surveying the construction. He looked uneasy, arms crossed over his chest. I approached him, keeping my voice calm. "Mark, what's going on here? Has the board approved a final vote on fencing?" He grimaced. "Karen insists the new fence is an urgent measure under the health and safety clause of the bylaws. Says we don't need a full vote for that." Harold tried to stop her, but she threatened to mobilize enough members to override him. She also claims she has the support of residents who are tired of dealing with farmland runoff. My stomach churned in anger. Karen was bypassing due process, forging ahead on her personal crusade. This is reckless. These farmers need full access to the channel. Mark lowered his voice. "I'm just the landscaping guy, John. I never wanted to fight with farmers. This all started as an idea to keep the boundary looking neat. But Karen took it and ran with it. She's unstoppable when she sets her mind on something." I pressed him gently. "But you do see the problems here, right? The fence is more than an eyesore. It's a direct interference with farmland water management." He nodded, eyes flicking toward the anxious farmers. "Yeah, I see it. I'll do what I can to slow this down. I might be able to argue that the design violates some local fence height rules or that we need a separate permit. That might buy us time." Relief washed over me. Mark, though not as forceful as Karen, might be an ally on the board. "Thank you," I said. "Every bit of delay helps. Meanwhile, I'll try to get an injunction to stop the fence entirely." As we parted ways, I felt a renewed sense of urgency. Karen wasn't waiting for votes or debates. She was forging ahead on her plan with no regard for the farmers or the laws. I decided that if she wouldn't listen to reason, I would have to escalate matters immediately. I rushed back to my home office and compiled every relevant statute, every piece of documentation, and every photograph showing how the fence would obstruct the irrigation channel. With these in hand, I contacted the county courthouse. As chief agricultural inspector, I had the authority to request an emergency injunction against any construction that jeopardized critical agricultural infrastructure. The clerk recognized my credentials and said a judge could review my filing as early as the next day. True to her word, the judge scheduled a hearing within 48 hours. On the appointed morning, I drove to the county courthouse, accompanied by two local farmers, Carlos and Marjorie, who would offer first-hand testimony about the impact of the fence. Karen was officially notified of the hearing, but she neither showed up nor sent a lawyer. Harold arrived, looking frazzled, ready to speak on behalf of the HOA's official position. Inside a modest courtroom, we presented our evidence. Carlos described how the fence would block him from clearing debris and leaves from the channel, risking floods or water backup. Marjorie stressed that even a small disruption during the growing season could lead to crop failures. I laid out the legal framework that protected historically established irrigation routes, pointing to county and state codes. Harold admitted that the HOA was indeed building a fence, but attempted to claim it was a safety measure. He looked miserable while saying so, clearly torn between truth and Karen's influence. After a brief deliberation, the judge slammed down her gavel. An immediate injunction was granted, ordering all construction on or near the irrigation channel to cease. The partial fence would have to remain unfinished, and any existing posts would be removed until the matter was fully resolved in a formal hearing. As we left the courthouse, Carlos and Marjorie wore relieved smiles. "Thank you," Marjorie said. "This might just save our crops." But Harold's face was ashen. "Karen will be furious," he muttered. "She's going to see this as a betrayal. I don't know what she'll do next." I patted his shoulder sympathetically. If she has any sense, she'll back off before things get worse. Yet, I suspected Karen's pride wouldn't allow her to yield. Each time she faced a setback, she only seemed to double down. We had a legal blockade now, but I sensed she was far from conceding defeat. My suspicion proved correct less than a week later when I drove home from a routine inspection across town. As I turned onto the road leading to Ridgewood Bluffs, I noticed water pooling along the shoulder. At first, I thought it was just heavy rainfall overflow, but the sky had been clear for days. Alarmed, I parked my car and walked down the slope to investigate. To my shock, the irrigation channel that should have been half full with gently flowing water was nearly bone dry. Instead, a large metal plate was wedged into the channel near the outskirts of the neighborhood, effectively damming the flow. The water behind had diverted onto the roadside ditch, flooding it. Meanwhile, downstream, the farmland section of the channel trickled with barely a drop. Farmers were already gathering, some wading through muddy puddles to see if they could dislodge the makeshift dam. I rushed over to help. Carlos, drenched in sweat, gestured at the haphazard construction. Someone hammered in that plate overnight. It's blocked almost all our water. An older farmer shook his head. Never seen anything like this. They not only blocked the channel, but also forced the water to run off along the road. This is sabotage. Fury churned in my gut. I had no doubt who was behind this. Karen. Unable to proceed with her fence, she'd found a sneakier way to achieve the same goal, cutting off the farmland's water. I suspected she might try to excuse it later as temporary flood control or some other concocted reason. While the farmers hammered at the metal plate, I examined it closely. It was anchored into the channel's concrete sides with heavy bolts, likely installed by a professional or at least someone who knew construction. With enough tools, we could remove it, but that would take time the crops didn't have. Seething, I immediately called the county sheriff's office. This is John Green from the State Agricultural Department. I have an urgent case of trespass and vandalism to a critical irrigation channel. We need assistance right away. The dispatcher, sensing the seriousness in my voice, promised to send deputies. Meanwhile, I dialed Harold, hoping he could confirm or deny whether the HOA had authorized this. He answered in a flustered tone, claiming ignorance. I know nothing about it, he insisted. Karen never mentioned any new project. This is beyond anything we discussed. I'll meet you there. When Harold arrived, he stood aghast at the metal dam. This is insane, he muttered. We were under injunction. How could you do this? The question remained unanswered, but the blame was crystal clear. Karen had pushed her agenda beyond the realm of legal fences into outright sabotage. If the sheriff's investigation found evidence linking her to this act, the consequences would be far more severe than a mere HOA bylaw violation. Deputies arrived within an hour, parking their cruisers on the shoulder where the water had begun to recede. The farmer stood by, arms folded in anxiety and anger. Harold looked like he wanted to vanish. I introduced myself and explained the urgent situation. The lead deputy, a no-nonsense man named Officer Gilmore, asked pointed questions. This metal plate was installed when, he asked. Carlos answered, We noticed a drop in flow early this morning, around 6 a.m. The channel was fine last evening. And do you have any suspects? Several farmers looked at me, and I cleared my throat. We suspect it's related to the HOA's attempt to close off the channel. The treasurer, Karen, Brenda Farncourt, has been pushing to block the water. We also have an injunction that halted her fence project. Officer Gilmore scribbled in his notepad. I'll need statements from each of you. Then we'll examine the site more closely for evidence of who installed the plate. While we gave formal statements, the second deputy photographed the metal plate, the bolt holes, and the surrounding area. They also found fresh tire tracks leading away from the ditch, possibly from a small truck or trailer used to transport construction materials. Harold, as the HOA president, looked torn between defending the association and condemning the sabotage. He told the deputy that no official HOA decision had authorized such an act, which was true. But he also admitted Karen had privately spearheaded efforts to remove or cover the channel. Does Ms. Farncourt have access to HOA funds that could have paid for a project like this? Officer Gilmore asked, pen poised. Harold faltered. Technically, yes. She's the treasurer. She can issue checks under certain budget lines without immediate board approval. A flicker of understanding passed across Gilmore's face. We'll investigate all financial records and see if there's a paper trail. As the day wore on, county workers arrived with tools to remove the metal plate. It took hours, but eventually they pried it free, restoring water flow. By then, the farmland had missed nearly a full day's worth of irrigation, critical hours during a hot, dry spell. Some crops wilted. The farmer's frustration soared. I felt my own anger simmering. This was beyond petty. Karen's sabotage wasn't just an eyesore or inconvenience. It was actively threatening people's livelihoods. As chief agricultural inspector, I had a duty to prevent such harm, and I wouldn't hesitate to use every legal avenue available. News of the sabotage spread quickly through Ridgewood Bluffs. The next day, tongues wagged at the coffee shop, sidewalks, and even on social media. Some neighbors were horrified that someone would stoop to criminal behavior. Others shrugged, privately suspecting Karen's involvement, but not daring to speak up. A few even muttered that the farmland was asking for trouble by relying on the channel so close to the neighborhood. Despite the controversy, Karen was nowhere to be found, until she appeared at my doorstep, unannounced, late in the afternoon. I opened the door to find her standing there, arms crossed, face unreadable. "Hello, Mr. Green," she said coolly. I suppressed the urge to lash out. "Karen, what brings you here?" She exhaled sharply. "I've heard wild accusations that I'm responsible for blocking that irrigation channel. This is slander. People are pointing fingers at me without a shred of proof." My jaw clenched. "We have a sheriff's investigation ongoing. If you're innocent, I'm sure the evidence will bear that out." She narrowed her eyes. "You're quite the champion of these farmers, aren't you? Attending the hearing, obtaining an injunction, now stoking rumors that I financed an illegal operation. I try to keep my tone even. They rely on that water to survive. Cutting it off is effectively sabotage. Whoever did it committed a serious crime." Karen stepped closer, her posture confrontational. "I'm telling you clearly, I had nothing to do with that plate. The HOA is not responsible for vigilante actions. The whole ordeal is probably the farmer's doing, trying to create a spectacle for sympathy." Her words dripped with contempt. I realized in that moment there was no sense of remorse or compassion for the farmers. She believed wholeheartedly in her own narrative, or at least she intended to push it to save herself. Perhaps she truly thought she was the victim. "I suggest you speak with the sheriff," I said, forcing calm into my voice. "They'll want your statement." She huffed. "Already done. I have no reason to worry." Then a bitter smile curved her lips. "But you should watch your step, Mr. Green. You're meddling in matters beyond your scope. This is an HOA issue, and I won't let you or anyone else tarnish our community image." Before I could reply, she turned on her heel and left. I closed the door, my heart thudding. Karen had unwittingly threatened the wrong person. I was well within my professional scope to intervene, and if she thought I'd back down, she was sorely mistaken. The sabotage incident strained relationships within Ridgewood Bluffs. Neighbors who once socialized on tidy front lawns were now split into factions. Those who believed the farmland deserved protection, and those who sided with Karen's stance on beautifying or securing the neighborhood boundary. Tension simmered at every turn. Even the local bulletin board, usually filled with announcements about garage sales and lost pets, became a battleground where typed notes defending or attacking Karen's actions appeared daily. Karen, meanwhile, moved aggressively to quell dissent. She issued official HOA violation notices for the smallest infractions. Mailboxes not repainted on schedule, potted plants that clashed with the approved color scheme, driveways with minor cracks. Residents who dared question her about the sabotage found themselves hit with multiple citations. Harold called me one evening, sounding distraught. "She's punishing people for even speaking out," he said. "I don't have the power to override her citations. As treasurer, she monitors the association's finances and the fines we collect. Isn't there a mechanism to remove or recall a board member?" I asked. Harold hesitated. "Technically, yes, but Karen has a loyal following. Some people credit her with maintaining property values, and they admire her tenacity. I'm afraid we wouldn't muster enough votes to oust her, at least not easily." I sighed. The sheriff's investigation might change minds if they find evidence tying her to the sabotage. Harold murmured a reluctant agreement. We'll see. Then, almost as an afterthought, he added, there's an HOA meeting next week. She's determined to push a new bylaw about irrigation screening again. Claims she'll present so-called expert opinions on the health hazards of open channels. My blood boiled at the mention. She was doubling down, forging ahead with the same plan that had already been halted by a judge's injunction. If she succeeded in passing a bylaw that the farmland was obligated to comply with, a fresh legal nightmare would erupt, though she might not care, so long as she got her way. At that point, it was no longer a matter of negotiation. It was a question of accountability and stopping her from doing further harm. With tensions at a peak, I decided it was time to make my official role known to everyone in Ridgewood Bluffs. Perhaps the direct knowledge that they were tangling with the state's chief agricultural inspector would force them to reconsider Karen's agenda. So, on the day of the HOA meeting, I walked in wearing my department badge on a lanyard around my neck, along with a thick folder labeled State Agricultural Department, Legal Documents. The community center was packed, standing room only. Karen sat at the front table with her usual hawkish demeanor. Harold, Linda, and Mark looked anxious. A hush fell over the crowd as I took a seat in the front row. Karen's eyes flicked to my badge, and a flicker of confusion crossed her face. Harold cleared his throat. Welcome, everyone. Before we begin, Mr. Green has requested the floor. John, please go ahead. I stood, turning to face the crowd. Good evening, neighbors. My name is John Green, and I'm not just a resident here. I'm also the Chief Agricultural Inspector for this region. My office is responsible for ensuring farmland and irrigation systems comply with state regulations. It has come to my attention that the HOA is considering measures that could severely disrupt a legally protected irrigation channel. A ripple of murmurs spread through the audience. Some looked stunned, others curious. I continued, undeterred. We already have an injunction preventing further fencing that would impede water flow. Moreover, any sabotage or unauthorized modifications are subject to investigation by the sheriff's office. I am here to caution this association that proceeding with any bylaw that undermines the channel's function is illegal under multiple state codes. Violators can face civil and criminal penalties. Karen rose halfway from her seat, face flushed. This is an HOA matter, Mr. Green, not a farmland matter. You have no authority to meddle in. I raised a hand to stop her. On the contrary, Ms. Farncourt, state law is crystal clear. Farmland irrigation channels established prior to the development of residential neighborhoods retain their easements and rights of usage. The sabotage we witnessed is a blatant violation. If the HOA endorses or enables such actions, it will be liable. And if an individual is found responsible, they will face the consequences. A hush fell. People exchanged uncertain glances, clearly shaken by the gravity of my statements. Even some of Karen's loyal supporters fidgeted nervously. Harold cleared his throat. Thank you for clarifying, Mr. Green. Let's proceed to the bylaw agenda item and discuss responsibly. But Karen wasn't done. She glared daggers at me, trembling with barely suppressed rage. I find it quite convenient that you forgot to mention your position until now. This is a conflict of interest. You're living here, but you're using your job to strong-arm us. I locked eyes with her. I moved here to observe farmland practices near the neighborhood. I had no intention of interfering in HOA matters until you tried to cut off water that families depend on to make a living. That's not just an HOA matter. It's a fundamental violation of state law. Furious whispers ran through the crowd. Karen opened her mouth to retort, but Mark, the landscaping director, stood up quickly. Let's calm down. We're all neighbors here. Maybe we should reconsider this bylaw. We don't want to break any laws or sabotage farmland. The tension in the room was palpable. Karen looked like she might explode, but for once, she was outnumbered by caution. The farmers who had gathered at the back exchanged hopeful glances. The seeds of a rebellion against her high-handed ways had been sown. Just when I thought the situation might de-escalate, the sheriff's office took a bold step. 2 days after the contentious HOA meeting, A squad of deputies arrived at the Ridgewood Bluffs administrative office with a search warrant. Rumors spread that they were investigating alleged financial irregularities connected to the sabotage. Word was that they suspected Karen had funneled HOA funds into a secret account to pay for the metal plate and labor to install it. I watched from my driveway as the deputies carried out boxes of files and a computer tower from the small building that housed the HOA's records. Neighbors stood at a distance, whispering in hushed tones. Mark and Linda hovered nearby, anxious and unsure. Harold wrung his hands, looking guilt-ridden for not having reined Karen in sooner. An hour later, a black, unmarked sedan pulled up. A stern-faced detective stepped out, conferred with the deputies, then strode purposefully toward Karen's house. She wasn't there. Rumors said she'd left early that morning, but they taped a notice to her door, summons for questioning. It was the first tangible sign that the law was closing in on her. The sabotage, once a rumor whispered behind closed doors, now pointed directly to her. And beyond that, if the allegations of misusing HOA funds were true, Karen might be facing charges of fraud or embezzlement. Neighbors, who had once cowered under her scrutiny, began to talk openly about her bullying tactics. People told stories of receiving false violation notices if they disagreed with her. Some claimed they'd seen suspicious checks with her signature, paid out to contractors who never seemed to show up for actual HOA projects. For my part, I kept out of the fray, focusing on the farmland's immediate needs. With the sabotage undone, the channel was flowing again, though a few fields showed signs of stress from the temporary cutoff. I worked with the farmers to assess crop damage, filing an official claim with the state so they might receive compensation if sabotage was proven in court. The sense of anticipation in the air was almost electric. Everyone wondered, would Karen attempt to deny everything, or would she vanish entirely? Would she lash out with another underhanded move? One thing was certain. Her reign of intimidation was unraveling, and the community was no longer under her thumb. Despite the mounting evidence, Karen showed up at the following HOA board meeting as if nothing were amiss. Her posture was rigid, her expression a mask of defiance. She announced that she would continue as treasurer until proven otherwise, brushing off the allegations as a witch hunt. But the atmosphere had shifted dramatically. Harold and Linda demanded she address the allegations of unauthorized spending. Mark, who had grown increasingly disenchanted, produced documents showing suspicious payouts for boundary improvement services, matching the timeline of the sabotage. Several residents also stepped forward, claiming they'd seen trucks working in the dark near the channel. Trucks with license plates connected to the same contractor listed on Karen's invoices. Realizing she was cornered, Karen lashed out. "You're all ungrateful. Everything I've done was for the good of Ridgewood Bluffs. It's not my fault the farmland is an eyesore. Why should we be forced to accommodate them?" She shot me a venomous glare. "And you're using your government job to bully a private citizen." I stood calmly. "My job is to uphold the law, Miss Farncourt. And if there's one thing that's clear, it's that you've disregarded legal boundaries." Someone from the audience called out, "You can't just steal HOA funds and sabotage farmland to get your way." Another added, "We're done with you, Karen. Resign." The meeting descended into chaos, shouting, accusations, demands. Finally, Harold banged a gavel, calling for order. He asked for a motion. Should Karen be suspended from her position pending the sheriff's investigation? The motion carried by a landslide. Karen stood there, stunned, color draining from her face, as the community she had once dominated with fear turned against her. Linda read out the formal suspension notice, while Mark quietly collected the HOA checkbook, keys, and documents from Karen's seat. Karen's lips twisted in rage. With one final withering glare, she stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her so hard it rattled the windows. Silence followed, broken only by the collective exhale of relief from the residents who remained. But as I watched her leave, I knew she was far from finished. A person who had built her identity around power and control wouldn't go quietly. I braced myself for whatever desperate move she might attempt next. 2 nights later, An urgent phone call woke me at 3 a.m. A panicked farmer reported that his crops were being flooded. Apparently, the irrigation channel's gate, which regulated the amount of water released, had been forcibly opened wide, sending a torrent of water rushing into the fields. If left unchecked, the entire area could be swamped, drowning the crops in stagnant pools. I threw on clothes and drove to the farmland, my headlights slicing through the darkness. Upon arrival, I found a chaotic scene. Water pouring into the fields, farmers struggling with makeshift barriers, flashlights bobbing in the night. One farmer had already called the local fire department, hoping their pumps could help redirect the overflow. Carlos spotted me, rushing over. They forced the gate open. We can't close it. The mechanism is jammed. My mind immediately flew to Karen. She was suspended, cornered by accusations. Would she stoop to one final act of sabotage? Flooding farmland was just as destructive as cutting off the water. Either way, the crops were ruined. I examined the gate's control box. It was padlocked, but the lock had been cut, wires torn out, leaving the mechanism locked in an open position. We need a special key or tools to fix this. Let's call the county maintenance crew. While we waited for help, I snapped pictures of the damage, documenting everything. Footprints in the mud, tire marks near the gate, the severed lock. The entire fiasco reeked of sabotage, done by someone who knew exactly how to cripple the farmland again. Around dawn, the county's crew arrived. They managed to partially close the gate by manual override, slowing the surge of water. A few fields were already swamped beyond salvage. Farmers shook their heads in despair, calculating how much of their income might be lost. As the sun rose, I felt a surge of determination. This time, we wouldn't just file a report. We'd push for immediate charges. The sabotage had to stop. If Karen was indeed behind this, she'd have nowhere left to hide. A few hours later, the sheriff's deputies arrived, investigating the new sabotage. They meticulously collected evidence, matching footprints, examining the cut padlock, and analyzing the tire tracks. I provided my photographs and statement, including my strong suspicion that Karen was responsible, given her previous attempts to disrupt the channel. Coincidentally, or perhaps not, Karen was spotted driving her golf cart along the ridge that morning. Officers intercepted her. According to bystanders, she tried to drive away, but a deputy signaled her to stop. After a brief, heated exchange, Karen found herself in handcuffs, arrested on suspicion of multiple counts: felony vandalism, trespassing, destruction of agricultural property, and potentially fraud connected to the misuse of HOA funds. As she was led away, her face was a mask of fury and disbelief. She screamed accusations of conspiracy, claiming the farmland owners had framed her. But the mounting evidence told a different story. Deputies discovered a toolkit in her golf cart, complete with bolt cutters and gloves caked in mud that matched the soil from the farmland gate. Combined with the suspicious financial records already under investigation, it painted a damning picture. Word of Karen's arrest spread like wildfire through Ridgewood Bluffs. Some residents peered from behind curtains as the squad car drove her away. Others gathered in small groups on sidewalks, discussing her downfall with hushed relief. A handful expressed pity, but the consensus was that her arrogance and aggression had led her to ruin. I watched from a distance, a swirl of emotions coursing through me. Relief that the sabotage might finally stop, anger at the damage she had already caused, and sadness that a community had been torn apart by one person's obsession. One thing was certain: the farmland's crisis wouldn't end with just an arrest. We still had to ensure the channel was secure, the crops were salvaged, and the HOA was set on a path of genuine reform. Karen's arrest triggered a cascade of legal actions. Over the next few weeks, the sheriff's office formally charged her with vandalism and trespassing, for installing the metal plate that blocked the channel and for forcibly opening the irrigation gate; criminal mischief, for causing extensive damage that led to crop losses; misappropriation of HOA funds. Investigators found records of checks issued to shell contractors. Defying a court injunction, she proceeded with actions explicitly forbidden by the judge's ruling. The judge ordered her held without bail, citing a high risk of further sabotage. The farmland sabotage was no mere property dispute. It was an assault on crucial infrastructure. Farmers, fed up with the repeated attacks, joined together in a civil suit against Karen and, by extension, the HOA's insurance provider for enabling her. Meanwhile, Ridgewood Bluffs reeled from the fallout. Residents demanded answers from the remaining board members, who insisted they had not authorized Karen's extreme measures. Harold stepped down as president, expressing remorse for not stopping her sooner. Mark and Linda stayed on temporarily, promising to organize new elections for a reformed board. In the farmland below, the damage varied. Some fields had recovered from the short-term dryness, but others were ruined by the flood. The local extension office helped farmers replant certain crops or salvage whatever they could. My role as chief agricultural inspector was to document the losses, ensuring they could apply for state-funded emergency assistance. Every so often, I'd catch a glimpse of the partially built fence along the boundary, an ugly monument to Karen's misguided war on farmland. By court order, it remained dismantled. The channel was restored to its proper condition, and county workers installed additional security measures to prevent future tampering. Though the situation was improving, the community's mood was somber. People whispered that if one person's vanity and aggression could cause so much harm, perhaps the entire notion of an overbearing HOA needed rethinking. If nothing else, the name Karen Farncourt became a cautionary tale, one that neighbors would be recounting for years. As the legal proceedings moved forward, life in Ridgewood Bluffs gradually normalized. The suffocating fear of Karen's wrath dissipated, replaced by cautious optimism. After all, with her in custody, no new sabotage could occur. The farmland's water flowed freely. Fewer compliance notices littered mailboxes. In short, the community began to heal. A newly appointed interim board worked to rebuild trust. They organized volunteer groups to help the farmers repair fences, clear debris, and replant damaged areas. One weekend, dozens of residents, families, retirees, even a few teenagers, headed down to the fields with shovels and seeds. That simple act of solidarity seemed to mend some of the rifts Karen had created. I continued my inspections, ensuring each farm met state standards and verifying the new security measures at the channel's gates. More than once, I found myself pausing to share a friendly laugh with farmers I once only knew professionally. The crisis had brought us all closer. The sense of neighborly compassion felt stronger than it ever had. Meanwhile, attorneys for both sides prepared for a trial. Karen faced a litany of charges that could lead to a lengthy prison sentence. Many believed she'd try to strike a plea deal, given the overwhelming evidence. But rumor had it that she was refusing any plea, still convinced she'd been victimized by a grand conspiracy led by meddling farmers and a power-hungry government official, namely me. The local news channels occasionally ran updates about the case, labeling it the irrigation sabotage scandal. Interviews with impacted farmers revealed the heartbreak of losing months of labor and thousands of dollars in revenue. Some reporters reached out to me for comment, but I kept it brief. The state's position is clear. Agricultural infrastructure is protected by law, and any deliberate damage to it is a serious crime. Among the residents, there was talk of holding a large community barbecue to celebrate the farmland's partial recovery and to welcome the new interim board. It felt like a symbolic gesture, turning the page on Karen's destructive chapter and forging a more cooperative future. I offered to help plan it, seeing it as a perfect chance for neighbors to unite in positivity after so much turmoil. 6 months later, the day of Karen's trial finally arrived. The courthouse was packed with onlookers, journalists, and many Ridgewood Bluffs residents who had come to witness the final act of the drama. The farmers sat together in the front rows, determined to see justice served for the harm inflicted on their livelihood. I testified about my official findings: the sabotage of the channel, the forcibly open gate, and the direct violation of state agricultural law. The sheriff's investigators presented compelling forensic evidence. The tools found in Karen's possession, the financial records tracing HOA money to suspicious contractors, and security camera footage that placed her near the site on the nights of both sabotage incidents. Farmers recounted their losses: withered crops, drowned fields, thousands of dollars gone overnight. Karen's defense tried to argue that she acted in good faith to address a public health hazard, but the judge repeatedly reminded the court that ignoring injunctions and vandalizing infrastructure could never be justified as mere community improvement. By the time final statements were delivered, the outcome was obvious. When the jury returned a guilty verdict on all major counts, the judge wasted no time. She sentenced Karen to 5 years in prison, citing her flagrant disregard for the law and the devastating impact on local agriculture. Furthermore, she was ordered to pay restitution to the farmers. Because she'd misappropriated HOA funds, a separate civil suit led to a judgment that seized her property to repay debts incurred by the association. Her once pristine home in Ridgewood Bluffs would be sold, the proceeds going back into a fund for community restoration and compensating impacted farmers. A hush fell over the courtroom as Karen was led away in handcuffs, her arrogant demeanor finally shattered. The story of the HOA Karen, who waged war on farmland, ended with her downfall: property lost, freedom revoked. In the days that followed, Ridgewood Bluffs breathed a collective sigh of relief. A new board was elected, promising transparency, compassion, and collaboration with neighboring farmlands. Harold, having stepped aside, found a sense of peace in quieter retirement. Mark continued to oversee landscaping, but now in a spirit of cooperation rather than confrontation. Linda worked hard to mend the community's image. The farmland slowly recovered. With state assistance, the farmers replanted and revitalized their fields. Though the sabotage had cost them dearly, the outpouring of community support was a silver lining. The relationship between Ridgewood Bluffs and the farmland grew closer than ever, forged by shared adversity. As for me, I remained in Ridgewood Bluffs, watching the sun rise over the fields each morning, a reminder of why I'd chosen this place. My job as Chief Agricultural Inspector continued, but now it felt more personal. I saw firsthand how farmland wasn't just about crops. It was about the families behind them and the communities that owed them respect and cooperation. On a bright summer day, the entire neighborhood came together for that long-awaited barbecue, tables laden with fresh produce grown right below the ridge. We feasted on grilled corn, homemade salsa, and juicy tomatoes. Music played, children laughed, and farmers clinked glasses with residents in celebration. The irrigation channel, gurgling happily at the bottom of the slope, symbolized the lifeblood of both farmland and fellowship. In the end, Karen's downfall served as a lesson in humility and boundaries. No matter how strict an HOA might be, it could never trample the law nor the moral imperative to preserve essential resources. At last, Ridgewood Bluffs embraced a spirit of unity, ensuring that farmland and suburb alike flourish side by side, free from sabotage and unshackled from fear.